Okay, so a portrait of Victorian Colchester, and you all know the scene. It's Colchester High Street. This is about 1860s, I suppose, and we've got the iconic fire office there to look at. So let's get our first slide up, and we'll now what I will say at the beginning of this talk, we're not actually going to go very far. We're probably going to, in the first half of this talk, probably go 50 yards down the road. But what we're looking at here is this lovely colour picture, which is a little bit pre-Victorian, I grant that, but it's such a lovely image, and it's one of the earliest images we've got detailing some of these buildings. Produced by a chap called William Bartlett in 1831. He actually did two pictures. He did one, the top of the high street that we're looking at now, looking east, and then he did another one from the bottom end, looking west. But on this particular image, the fire office is what we call the fire office, stands there dominant. When this was painted, that was only about 11 or so years old. It had been built during 1819, opened in 1820, and it was from the very beginning a dual purpose building. The top floor was the Essex and Suffolk Fire Insurance Society, and the bottom floor was the corn exchange, where the farmers would come and deal and sell their corn. You'll notice this image, it really makes the high street look 2 or 3 times wider than it actually is. So there's a bit of artistic license there. It's never been as wide as that, but you can, it's quite nice because you can see all these cows walking around. This of course was the marketplace up until the early 1860s. And from here right down to St Rumwell's Church, which you can see in the background here, this is where there would be hundreds of sheep, pigs, there'd be cattle, horses, and sometimes they overflowed into Head Street and also a little bit down North Hill outside St Peter's Church on busy days. And the important part about this picture, as we're going to discuss in a moment, in 1842 there was a disastrous fire that destroyed lots of buildings, going down from the fire office towards the town hall, and many of these buildings that you can see here were no more after 1842. But so let's move on, and that's the modern view. So this obviously is correct. I know they've narrowed our high street just a little bit, but just to go back again, you can see, you know, the complete difference. So this is more of what it is now. Now, one thing that many people, even local people, don't really notice because they don't probably look, I know you will all know this, but the fire office that you're looking at now is different from this building. And if you look at this building, you've got the ground floor and you've got the first floor with a little pediment on here. And yet on this one, we've got another story, a complete second story was added in 1914. So, and the whole building, as you're probably aware, is made of brick, which is quite unusual at that time because there were still lots of timber frame buildings. And it's made of brick, and most of that brickwork is clad in large sheets of cast iron. And even those Greek Doric columns, which you can see running down here, there's 8 along the front and another 8 further back, so 16 altogether, and they're also made of cast iron. Obviously, the last thing they wanted, being a fire insurance society, was to suffer a fire when everything would be destroyed. This is how it looked when it was built. So this is 1820 as originally constructed. It's interesting, if you look under the clock on the pediment there, it's got Essex Fire and Life Office. It's quite interesting because by 1806 they had added the word Suffolk. It was the Essex and Suffolk from 1806, but so I'm not quite sure why that's there, but there it is. I say Greek Doric, and this is where you could go right through here. Now we've got shops in the back of all these little areas here, as you can see from this more modern view. So if you look through the back, you can see these other Doric columns standing at the back. Now, one of the things which is quite interesting, we don't know a lot about how it was actually built, but we do know something. We do know, for example, how they leveled these columns. Now, when you're standing these columns up, and they're 13 or so feet high, they've got to be dead upright. There can't be any margin for error. And I don't know whether some of you have seen this. I'm sure many of you would have done. Unfortunately, what I'm going to tell you is not there anymore. But if you look, or it's actually just there. There may have been some others. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to move on to the next slide. And there's a wedge. Now, that was under that column there, right at the end. And there's a close-up of it. And I remember seeing that. This particular picture was taken for me by, well, not for me particularly, but by Tony Butcher, the late Tony Butcher. And that is a cast iron wedge. And that cast iron wedge had probably been in position for over 190 years or so. And I can imagine when they first stood those columns up, someone said it's not quite upright. So they get these wedges and ram them in just to keep it perfectly. I did hear someone say they do remember seeing one or two others further along. But if you go there now, that's completely gone. Now, they have put a slightly thicker fillet of cement on around here, so they may well have covered it up. But I think someone just got a club hammer and smacked it off, which is quite a shame. And it may have been done. All right, let's go back. It may have been done. I'll come back to that one. It may have been done when they did the last refurbishment work, which was in 2009. You may remember there was big scaffolding around it. I may be able to come back to that in a moment. While we're on this, can I just share this with you? This is Chichester. And my wife and I were down in Chichester several years ago now. And if anyone remembers what I'm going to tell you, you can tell me at the end of the talk. But I walking along the main street in Chichester and saw this massive, great Greek Doric building. And straight away, I thought of the fire office. And at the time, it was a McDonald's restaurant. And I think in later years, it's the next fashion store. And in previous years, it had been the first cinema in Chichester. But my wife went in there. Maybe she went to get something to eat or drink, I don't know. And I just sort of wandered around the corner and saw this I thought, I wonder what that little plaque on the wall says. And when I got close, I read that it was the original Corn Exchange. And I thought, I wonder, is it a coincidence that their Corn Exchange is Greek Doric, our Corn Exchange is Greek Doric? I'd love to know whether other corn exchanges in the country, if you know of any, please let me know. Was it a thing for corn exchanges to be done in this Greek revival, in this sort of Greek Doric style? I don't know, but I just thought that was, I just thought I'd throw that in. This is the picture I meant to put earlier. This was in 2009, I took this picture when they were doing a lot of paint work and everything. And I just wonder whether that little wedge might have got chopped off at the time. Anyway, another image, another early image we've got of Colchester High Street, 1825. This is from Thomas Cromwell's History of Colchester. And it shows the fire office, of course, and the street packed with people. And this is more realistic. This is as the street is really, not like that wide one that seemed too wide. This is probably about how it is. And the thing to remember, of course, this was the A12 of its day. There wasn't even a railway. So if people wanted to go from London or from Essex into East Anglia, Harwich or anywhere like this, chances are they had to go down Colchester High Street. Now they could have gone, I suppose, down Priory Street, John Street and various, but most of the traffic would have gone through here. And it's interesting that you've got groups of 20 or 30 men, several, and that's what it would have been like. This would have been a giant meeting place. It was the market, we know, but I'm sure people would have congregated there and stopped and met their friends and so on and so forth. This is a lovely image, a very important one. It's not the earliest, but it's one of the earliest photographic images taken in Colchester in 1858. And it shows it's market day. And we can see on the right-hand side pens full of sheep. It looks like the pens full of sheep go all the way down here. It's thronged with people. Here we've got a four-wheeler brougham carriage, hackney carriage. Further back in the middle, you can just see a hansom cab with the driver sitting right back at the top. And you can just about see another cab here. This was one of the cab ranks outside the fire office. You can see that there. But the thing that amazes me about this photograph is how clear it is considering the time it was taken. Snapshot photography hadn't been invented. This snapshot photography was still 25 years into the future. And people had to stand still. There was long exposures, at least 30 seconds, but it could be more. So I find this astonishing how everybody's come out in the image. You can just see someone moving quickly here, look, so he's just a blur. So it may just be the photographer tried this several times, or he waited and waited and waited until he got as what he thought. And so that's a fantastic picture. Probably the same photographer, I'm not sure, probably the same photographer took two other pictures standing roughly here. And his first one, he pointed in that direction towards where the Old Town Hall was, which you can see there. And the second picture, he did it in the opposite direction, looking towards the fire office. Now, if you look in the top picture, there are two gentlemen having a talk here. Now, even if you're standing still, having a talk with someone on the pavement in Colchester or elsewhere, you can't help sort of moving around a little bit. You shuffle on your feet, you sort of go backwards and forwards, you gesticulate and all the rest of it. Now, at this age with photography, if you did that, your chances are you're not going to get the exposure right. And if I just show you what happened with those two gentlemen, you can see through his head at the windows in the building behind, in the town hall. I don't know if you can see that, folks, because although he's not moving much, he's slightly moving. And so can you understand now why I think this is such a fantastic picture? How it's come out as it is remarkable. It's slightly blurred, but you know, that's good. Just to show you a couple of examples with early photography. You know, the problem was people had to stay rigidly still for at least 30 seconds, maybe up to 2 minutes. And this is 1847, it's quite an early one. And this is typically, it's a studio picture. And you can see how people brace themselves to stay still for the exposure time, whether it's 30 seconds or a minute. And often they would sit with their, you know, resting their head on their arm or something like that. Here we've got another, this is 1856-ish. And it's okay, you can get the older children to concentrate for a few seconds, but I don't know if you can see this little baby, which has probably been wriggling around. You can't keep the baby still, so her face looks a bit ghostly. It's a bit of a blur. And in some images that I've seen, the total images of the babies are completely gone. There's no face, there's just a white blob. What they often used to do apparently with babies, they would wait till they get them to go to sleep, and then they can keep them still and everybody else. Because this is still, at this time of day, these could cost up to £1 each for one of these. It's very expensive before they came down cheaper as time went on. One of my favourite early photographs, this is Hannah Prattley and George Taylor. They reckon this is the earliest wedding day picture known. We're not saying there might not be an early one, but this is the earliest they could find. And one of the tricks they used to do, in the early days, if you went to have your photograph taken, they would ask you to concentrate on something. So fix your eye on the wall, fix it on the clock behind me, and don't dare take it off. And it looks like these two people are both looking at something, but they're looking at different things. She's looking over here, and he's looking at something completely in the opposite direction. But that's what you get with some of these early images. So look, back to the high street again. You'll note we haven't travelled far, maybe 100 yards at the most. Now, of course, as I said earlier, I talked about this fire. In 1842, there was a terrible fire which ravaged all these buildings. And we've got a fantastic painting of it. The fire took place on Saturday night. It was reported about 11:30 on 30th of April. And it went through to the 1st of May. So it was overnight from Saturday to Sunday. And 3 buildings here you can see were completely destroyed. Talk more about those in a moment. This building here, which is part brick, that was partly destroyed. And there's 2 timber frame buildings here, which also had to be partly pulled down. You can see there's crowds of people here. So this is around midnight, just after. And you can see hoses spraying water here, there and everywhere. And what we've got if you look carefully, you can see there's lines of people. There's a line of people at the back here and another one here passing buckets from one person to the next. And when they get right up to near the end, it looks like they're then putting the water into the pump. Now the Essex and Suffolk, the Essex and Suffolk had their own fire engines, in inverted commas, and these fire engines were basically a large wooden box which was transported on a little wagon. It could be rigged up to a horse if they have to go any distance, and they kept the horses behind the Cups Hotel. But it was basically a large wooden box lined with lead, and they would pour water into it as quick as they could, and from there they could pump water using their hoses onto these various buildings. At one stage, the flames from this congregation were flying across the road to where the bank was, setting light to the roof. A building in what is now Bank Passage caught light, and there's even reported that somewhere as far as Crouch Street even had little fires. So they're putting the water on this as well, but they're fighting it's a lost cause, really. And what they decided to do in the end, they decided once this brick building, they thought that would arrest the fire going further east. And when that started to go, they got the magistrates up at 3 o'clock in the morning to try and get an order to pull down these next two houses. And in the end, he gave permission to start pulling them down, and they took all the roofs off before finally they got the better of the fire. At the height of the fire, there were, I say, 3 engines belonging to the Essex and Suffolk, and they had sent to Whittam. They had an office at Whittam, and they sent for another one to come from Whittam. But the time the Whittam one got here, they'd got it under control. The reason why we know all this from this image here, there's just a close-up view of the bucket chains. Look, can you see the bucket chains? Now, I'm not sure exactly whether the buckets are coming along here and then they're being tipped in, and then he's passing the empty buckets back. It's a job to know exactly what's happening, but that's what it was. And this was painted by this gentleman here, John Vine. I'm sure you would have heard of John Vine. He was a well-known painter. Although he was severely disabled, he had malformed arms, so his fingers weren't quite right. And he came. John Vine was born in Bury St Edmunds in 1808. His father was a shoemaker. And when he was young, I know it's not politically correct to probably say this now, but his parents more or less put him in a freak show. And it's believed that he was paraded around fairs and things like this, so people can pay so much money to come and have a look at him. And we can see here, so there's the John Vine we looked at just now. This is when he's a fairly young man. He actually moved to Colchester, by the way, when he was about in his early 20s. And he and his family all moved to Colchester, and they took on a small holding of 4 acres between Malden Road and Butt Road. And John, despite his disabilities, he went on to become not a fantastic painter, but he earned a good living as a portrait and animal painter, as you can see down the bottom here. He would go around the agricultural shows and get commissions to paint these great big cows and bulls and pigs and horses, and he did quite well. This picture here is from the British Museum, and he's quite young here, and what he's got is he's holding a little portrait or a drawing he's done here with a pen in this hand. And it seems that he would, going around these fairgrounds, what have you, one of his like party pieces was he would just do a drawing for someone straight away. Over here, this is an advertisement, freak of nature. That's what they called it in those days. John Vine, a child of 11 months born with imperfect arms and hands, being differently informed, one being longer than the other. And they go on to explain that. And then they say, thus being denied the means of future support, the parents submit with considerable reluctance to a public exhibition solely for the future benefit of the child. He can be seen at Mr. Frost, the baker's in Abbeygate Street. Ladies and gentlemen, they can pay what they like. Tradesmen pay a shilling, working people and children pay sixpence, but parents will wait on gentlemen at their own house if required. And it's assumed that he went through his childhood and teenage years like this before finally settling in Colchester and becoming quite an established painter. We spoke about the fire engines, 3 fire engines, and they would have been this sort of thing here. This is one of them which survived. It's still around somewhere. You may remember it was in Holy Trinity Social History Museum for many years. And like many of, so there's the big wooden box, basically, that's containing the water, leather buckets, and you'd have a handle on one side here, another handle at the top, and you'd get 3 or 4 men. Each side would be pumping up and down. So as quick as they pump the water out, people have got to put more water in. And certainly by the 18th century, most parishes had to have a fire engine. It was law. And when we say fire engine, they were quite small. If you look at church wardens' accounts, for example, you'll often find references to paid so-and-so for repairing the engine, or paid so-and-so for painting the engine or something. And they're talking about the fire engine. And this is what they look like. This is a typical late 18th century. There's one there, another one here. This is so not as good as the Essex and Suffolks, but this is a typical 18th century fire engine, which may be kept in the porch of the church or perhaps somewhere. And this one, again, it's just a little box, pour water in, and one person that side, same principle, pump the water. Now, when you think about it, so we've gone from, in less than 200 years, we've gone from that to something like this, haven't we? It's amazing, really. And even this is probably old-fashioned now. This is quite an old photograph in itself. I just want to go back to the aftermath. So we've got another painting here by John Vine, and this is the morning after. And the fire office, obviously with its cast iron sheeting, has survived. Let's see who lived in these other buildings. Well, the first one, this was the vicarage of St. Peter's. That's the Reverend Samuel Carr. Now, Samuel Carr wasn't feeling very well, and he'd been convalescing in London or Hampstead. So he and his wife weren't there, but his daughters and their servants were there. And then Charles Wallace, the ironmonger, it was behind his house, apparently, that the fire started in an out kitchen. And then we had George Knight, the seedsman. So those buildings went. Mr. Shuttleworth's house, although it was mainly a brick, as you can see, most of it has survived, but it was getting touch and go. And then we had 2 timber frame buildings, Mr. Rouse, the baker, and Mr. White, the shoemaker. And if we look on the first mention of the fire on the 6th of May, the following Friday, in the Essex Standard, there's an account of the fire, but also these 3 people, the Reverend Carr, Charles Wallace and George Knight, all write letters of thanks about the late fire. Samuel Carr's is dated on the 3rd of May, Charles Wallace on the 4th, and another one on the 4th. They're giving thanks to all their friends. What actually happened during the blaze, it's reported that there was about 500 labourers and mechanics, many from the railway labourers, the navvies who were working on the railway. Maybe they were lodging in town, I don't know, whether they came up, but many of them were helping doing this. The unfortunate thing is some of them later had to go to court because they were stealing furniture. What was happening before they got all the water organised, the first thing was to get these people out. So nobody died, they got them all out, ladders and everything, and then they emptied as what they could of the houses, of the valuables, furniture, what they could. A lot was destroyed, and some of these people had no insurance for the goods. But in the days that followed, there were several people taken to the magistrates' court because they'd actually taken advantage and were stealing candlesticks and all sorts of things and ferreting them home. This is what we couldn't see. This is Mr. Shuttleworth's house. That's the brick one you saw earlier. And here we Mr. Rouse, the baker, and Mr. White, the shoemaker's house. This is what the magistrate gave permission to pull down completely, although they only got all the roof off, all the timbers of the roof off, and then I think they had to pull it down anyway, but that was the problem. This particular image you're looking at is part of a drawing made by Mary Benham. I'd love to see the full version, but I've never actually been able to come across it. Now, one more little worth mentioning, just looking at the ruins of St Peter's Vicarage, a lot of this was timber frame, obviously apart from the brick chimneys, but in around 1780 the owners had put a brick front on, a Georgian front. So that Georgian front had survived somewhat, and we can see it in this image here. This is another image you've probably seen. This is a painting owned by St Peter's Church still at the moment, and it shows St Peter's Church. It was painted circa 1780. There's King Cole's pump, a public pump. That's still there. I can remember reading quite a few years back, gasmen working in the high street, and they found it. That well is still there. Well, it's been filled up. And this is St Peter's Church, and obviously it looks like it's sitting up in the air. And of course, not the fire office, but the exchange, or what was left of the Bay Hall would have been there. So it's a kind of artistic impression. But I think what the vicar was actually trying to show off was this, because this is about the time he had his brick front put on. Does that remind you of any other building in Colchester? There it is. I'm sure you've all seen it. It's very much the same as this one, isn't it? The Minories. They're the only two buildings in Colchester that have got a canted bay supported by a columned porch. It's very rare. The only other one similar in Colchester is in Head Street, but that's not a canted bay, that's more of a rounded bay. But they're so alike, it's almost, to have them, a bay is normally always connected to the floor in some way, but this is connected to the floor via a columned porch. It's quite unusual. Right, let's move on. Now this, one of my favourite photographs. This was published in 1874 by Mary Benham in a guide to Colchester and its environs, and it went to several editions later on. And the original one came with half a dozen real photographs in the book, and if you wanted that one it was 2 and 6pence, and if you wanted one without the photographs it was 1 and 6pence. But anyway, so here's this picture, and there's so much. Again, I'll just remind you, we still haven't gone very far. I just want to mention this here. St Runwell's Church we can see in the background. So obviously this is before 1878, because that's when it was pulled down, but we know it was 1874, the first edition. That building there, of course, is still there. At the time, it was Phillips Store here. In the 1861 census, there's about 7 or 8 workers all living on the premises, all got bedrooms up top here. And of course, I won't labour the point too much, but this is what it's like. It's still with us, of course. It doesn't quite look quite, we haven't got these Doric columns, these lovely bow windows here. It's now looks more like this. But that's, I just thought I'd share that with you as well. But back to this one. What really took me off, now this building's of interest, we'll come to that in a moment, but what really got me was this thing here. And that's a crossing place. That's a crossing place. And if you look at various other Colchester photographs, there are at least 4 crossing places in Colchester High Street alone. And I'm sure there was others in Head Street and so on. In the past, and particularly in, let's just move up to London for a moment. In many of the big cities, London, Manchester, and all the other big cities, people earned their living sweeping crossings. It was a job, all right, it was at the bottom of society. They didn't earn much, they were poor, but they earned their money. And if you had your little place up at Piccadilly Circus or somewhere in Regent Street, you could probably earn quite a lot of money. And what would happen is, because the streets were so dirty, they were all gravel and dirt, and in the winter it was very muddy, and the Victorian ladies with their long dresses swept the floor as they walked along the streets. They all got dirty. So they would have crossing places where people would walk in front of them with a broom, almost like, it reminds me of curling, when they throw the old curl, and they sort of get the old broom to make it slide quicker. And you can imagine people crossing the road, and without you asking, someone comes in front of you, sweeping the road in front of you, and when they get to the other side, they take their hat off and put it in front of you, and they want some money. It reminds me I'm sure you can remember this, not that long ago. It doesn't happen quite so much now. You know, you stopped at traffic lights and all of a sudden someone comes out and starts washing your car for you, your windscreen. Do you remember that? It's this kind of thing. They were a bit of a nuisance, but that's what happened. Just to add something else, last year we went down to the south of France and we was in Avignon and we stopped at some traffic lights. And when the cars all stopped, this guy got a little unicycle out and started doing tricks in front of the road. And I thought, well, he's going to have to stop soon because he's got to collect the money, because once the light changed, he's lost all his customers. And he'd obviously timed it perfectly. And right at the last minute, he jumped off and went round all the cars picking up his money. Now, if you want to know about crossing sweepers and all the other costermongers and all the street folk, you can't do better than read Henry Mayhew's London Labour and London Poor. And I've got Peter Evans to thank me for letting me. Peter's got the full set, 3 volumes plus the extra one. And so he copied this. But Henry Mayhew went around the streets of London and interviewed, among other people, crossing sweepers. And they told him how much they earn, what time they start, and so on and so forth. And it's fascinating how these people earn their money. Here we've got, on the left-hand side, there's a couple of young boys. The one on the right's got no shoes, no socks or shoes on. And they've obviously swept the street, and this gentleman has obviously given them a little bit of money. And on the other side here, it looks like these 2 ladies are trying their best to ignore him. He's obviously swept it. So they didn't always get their just rewards. In Mayhew's book, one of the characters that he interviewed was a one-legged sweeper. That's a fascinating little story. And then we've got this other lovely image by William Frith of a young lad, and this lady. You know, most people view them as a nuisance, I think, and to be tolerated. But it reminds me of, I've got up here the case of George Ruby. Now, George Ruby was a young crossing sweeper. Now, these crossing sweepers, I say, they lived on the edge of society. They had no money. George Ruby, I think, was an orphan. They didn't have homes. They lived off charity from others. And George Ruby, in 1848, this young lad, witnessed a crime, a violent crime. And he was called to court as a witness. And when they got him to court, he went into the witness box, and the person presiding was put into the box, and he was to be sworn in, and a testament was put in his hand. And when they put this testament in his hand, apparently he looked quite astonished, but he took hold of the book. And Alderman Humphrey, I'll just quote a few bits, he says, "Well, do you know what you are about? Do you know what an oath is?" "No." "Do you know what a testament is?" "No." "Can you read?" "No." "Do you ever say your prayers?" "No, never." "Do you know what prayers are?" "No." "Do you know what God is?" "No." "Do you know what the devil is then?" "I've heard of the devil, but I don't know him." "What do you know, my poor boy?" "I knows how to sweep a crossing." "And that's all?" "That's all. I sweeps the crossing." Now, Alderman Humphrey refused to take his testimony, couldn't be relied upon, etc., etc. And this was reported in all the local newspapers, and they thought it was wrong that this boy, although he was poor, he couldn't read and write, he couldn't have his testimony, because they thought that he wouldn't tell the truth, which was quite the opposite, because he answered all the questions that although he said no to every question, he was telling the truth. But anyway, one of the newspapers to report this was the Examiner. And one of the contributors to the Examiner at the time was a man called Charles Dickens. And it's interesting that just 2 or 3 years later, Charles Dickens brings out Bleak House. And one of the best known characters of Bleak House is Joe, the crossing sweeper. And in chapter 11 of the book, Joe, the crossing sweeper in Bleak House, also witnesses a crime, also has to go to court, also can't answer the questions, and his evidence is rejected. It might even be that Dickens was the one who wrote the report for the Examiner in the first place. So it's almost certain, can't be sure, that Joe, the crossing sweeper, was based on the real character of George Ruby. So let's go back to our little place again. Were there any crossing sweepers in Colchester? We know there were crossing places, but is there any evidence that people actually swept the roads? Well, I had a good look. It's a job to find any evidence, but a bit later I did look on the census for 1911. And I'll just blow this a little bit up here. And here we've got this labourer, and someone's written in here, crossing sweeper, employed by Borough Council. So I think we can be pretty sure that the Colchester Borough Council probably employed crossing sweepers whose job it was to keep these, you see, where these crossings were, there'd be stone sets in the ground, you know, so they could be easily be swept, and people would make for those so they could cross in a fairly clean fashion. Our final little stop here is this building on the left. Now this is what is now the Co-op Bank, but it was after the fire, it was rebuilt as a new corn exchange opening in 1844, and it's been the Repertory Theatre, many of you will know. It was Albert Hall, an art gallery, pupil teacher training centre, and various things over the years. And in this old picture of it here, and this must be from about 1860s, I would say, there are some statues. There's a large statue at the top here. There's a statue in the middle with two young children by the look of it. And then in each of these niches is a female character. According to Sigourney Benham, in one of his early directories, he reckoned that this was Britannia. Okay, but these two statues either side represented at the time ancient and modern agriculture. This is a corn market, corn exchange, so we're thinking of corn agriculture. So I'm not sure, but whether that, I would have thought that could even be Ceres, the goddess of corn and agriculture, rather than Britannia. I don't know why they would put Britannia up there, but anyway, I may be wrong. But apparently this didn't last very long. It wasn't made of very good stone, so that was removed. So many images you'll see of this don't have that statue up there. And these statues, of course, were also taken down, maybe for the same reason at some later stage. And many of you will remember, all being publicised some time ago now, this was in 1972, that they found when they pulled down the Cups Hotel, in the basement, they found the remains of these statues that went either side, the one that here and the one here. And they finally worked out they came originally from the corn exchange, from these niches. And when they repaired them, put them up together, they've now put them back again. They're on outside St Mary's car park. I'm sure you've all seen them. So that's modern and ancient agriculture, originally from the old corn exchange. I did wonder why they didn't put them back here. You know, that would have been quite nice. That's where they belonged. Maybe I don't know if the Co-op Bank had it then, but maybe they didn't want the light to be blocked out. I often wonder what it would have looked like if they had have put them there. Now, I hope you can see that. I'll do it one more time. You can't do this with 35mm slides so easy. But and what I've done on this particular showing, I've actually I found a little statue of, I'll go on them, hang on. Go back one more. Little statue of Britannia, and then I wasn't sure whether it should have been Ceres, so we've got both of them. But I don't know if you noticed that if I go back, when I did that little trick, I don't know if you noticed that I had to sacrifice this gentleman here. So when I put the window in, he had to go, but I forgot about his shadow. So you look. So some eagle-eyed person would think, well, where's that shadow come from? I wonder. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, we have really gone down the high street now. We're a couple of 100 yards away. Looking back, this is one of a select band of pictures really that are quite rare in as much that they haven't got Jumbo, the water tower. most pictures you have looking west will have jumbo there from 1882, 83 onwards. So this is an earlier image without jumbo. There's the old town hall, you can see here. But there's a nice little view of St Runmel's Church, showing the chancel and the sort of main nave area, if you like, and with a north aisle. Now, they could hardly put a south aisle on because the road would be reduced to about 12 feet wide. But and it was altered in the 18th century, given them a bit of a sort of classical sort of makeover. This is an image from 1813, and it shows a little classical door case look. But the interesting thing here is a little shop, because we know there used to be a shop built right up against St Runmel's Church, and also what was called Middle Row. And in this image, you can see they're still using the shop. There's meat or something hanging up outside there. And in this floor plan, in fact, if I just go back here, you'll see this bit goes back. There's a bit of a reveal there. So the chancel area is set back just a touch. You can see that on this plan here, look. There's the north aisle. And because of the lack of room, they've had to sort of come across here at a sort of funny angle. But look, there's the shops. And that's that little bit that was sticking out where we could see the meat and what have you hanging up. And I love this picture as well. It shows, you can see there's the chancel set back just a little bit as on the plan. There's the little shop, and there's the rest of some of the other buildings from Middle Row. And we can see over here, looks like a sheep hanging upside down outside a shop window there. We're near the end of this little walk down the high street. This is as far as we're going to go. We've gone down the other end of the high street. I just want to finish off talking just a little bit about St Nicholas Church. And on the left hand side at the top, we've got when it's in ruins. It's in ruins here as well, but there's one version of it. It had been in ruins for 150 or so years, and services were held in the bottom of the tower and the sort of west side of the church. Here we've got the clock, the projecting clock. Sometimes this was known as the frying pan church because it looked like a bit of a frying pan. This is probably about 1870s, early 1870s. Again, there's some people here who've realised the photographers out and about, and they're standing there, had their picture taken. But in 1875 onwards, for a couple of years, based on a design by Sir Gilbert Scott, they raised this new church from the foundations of this old one here. And they created this great early English Gothic style building. This picture was taken, there's one of two taken shortly after the scaffolding was taken down. I think he must be on an upper story of one of the buildings on the north side of High Street here. In the background, you can see the old town hall. And when the scaffolding was high up here, a man called George Joslin from the Joslin ironmonger family. Some of you will remember Joslin's on the top of Maidenborough Street, a very big shop. Another little one further up the high street in earlier days. And George Joslin was formerly the manager of the gasworks down the Hythe. Later he was a director. And later he moved to Beverley Road and started collecting Roman antiquities. And he ended up, eventually the Castle Museum, or the museum, bought his collection, and that was really the start of the museum's collection. He had hundreds and hundreds of items he dug up and found, including one of the two tombstones that we have. And he took some very early pictures down the Hythe, and he went up the scaffolding. We think it was him. It could have been his brother John. And he took a series of pictures, including these two. And one of them, another rare picture with no jumbo, one looking west, and this one looking down towards the east. On this one, look, let's just have a look at this one in a bit more detail. What is that there? That's another crossing place. There was a crossing place here. We've seen the one up here, and there was actually four altogether. But what I find interesting about this image, people say, well, where is everybody? It must be a Sunday. Well, if you look carefully, all these shop blinds on the what is still the sunny side of the street, all these shop blinds look like they're all out. It looks like a couple of people standing there having a chat, and the sun looks high. It looks like midday almost. The shadows are right underneath. And it could just be, of course, that, again, we're getting close, but we're not there yet. We're not in the age of snapshot photography till about 10 years later. So it could be that any vehicles or anything that's moving just hasn't come out on the picture. And just to illustrate that, this is the last slide, I think, almost. Let's have a look. I thought I'd just share this one with you. This is a Parisian street. And this is the first photograph, so it says, the first known photograph of the human being ever taken. I've added the S on the end of the question mark. And this was taken by Louis Daguerre, the originator of the daguerreotype photograph that became very popular in the 1840s and 50s, in about 1839. And it looks like there could be a vehicle or something here, but everything is moving probably. And the only reason why we've got somebody captured here, and he became known as the first human being ever photographed, because he stopped still long enough to have his shoes cleaned. He stopped to have his shoes cleaned, and hence he's come into history. He's been caught on the image. Now, the reason why I put an S there, what about the bootblack? Because he's also been caught on the image. And if we just go back, it looks like there's two gentlemen sitting there who may also, that's why I've put the S. But most books would tell you that this gentleman here was the first man. So going back to our final picture we looked at, it could just be, there could have been a lot more going on in the high street, lots of vehicles, but maybe the photography wasn't quite up to it at that time. And that's where we're going to leave it, folks.